later. Welcome all. Good morning if you're in the European part. Good afternoon if you're more in Central Asian part. Welcome to the webinar that has been organized by me and Sofya. We are part of the London Research Network, Central Asia Research Network, but we're also part of the Central Asian writing academic community as well. So we have been doing quite a lot of marathons and writing activities. So today's webinar, thank you, Rico. Thanks a lot for agreeing to present today. I will introduce you, but before I just wanted to say a few words in terms of the initiative. The initiative is not completely new. We have already started as part of the LCARN and also academic writing community kind of initiative. We have already had a few seminars which had looked at some of the issues in terms of writing. So we had Erika Marat, I think in 2020, when she talked about also how to develop a new theory. We had Asel Tutumlu, who had talked about how to write a good paper. We also had Botoeva Kasambekova, who had looked at, in a very detailed way, actually, how to start putting together also your ideas based on your observations. And it was very, I think, fruitful. But that had been in the last academic year, and me and Sofya, we have been thinking about how to continue that. And one way was to think about in maybe a bit broader terms, because there have been lots of discussions in different marathons and different groups that sometimes early career researchers from Central Asia or writing about Central Asia, they find it difficult to link the theory with the data, or the theory doesn't match with the data that we gather. So we are thinking that it is not one-off event. We might continue depending on who agrees and if you find time for it. Welcome today. So this is one of the events that we are thinking that will be more like a series of different seminars and people talking about it. Anyway, so today's webinar is called Another Turn of the Crank, Theory and Data in Central Asian Studies. And welcome Dr. Rico Isaacs, who is Associate Professor in Politics at the University of Lincoln. And he has been an author of a number of books and co-edited a number of books. And the last one, I think the latest one, which came out in 2021, was co-edited with Erika Marat and is titled as Routledge Handbook of Contemporary Central Asian Studies. So, we will have also Sofya Boulay, who will be mainly looking after today, after the webinar. She is a doctoral student at the University of Oxford Brookes, right? And she is doing her doctoral thesis on in politics. So welcome all, and maybe Sofya might give you a few words in terms of, say a few words in terms of the housekeeping at the moment.
Just want to add a little bit on what Gulzat just mentioned. If you have any feedback, you're more than welcome to contact either myself or Gulzat and send us your suggestions of how can we improve this type of conversation. Also, the choice of Dr. Isaacs was not spontaneous. We thought well about who can be the best person to present, and because many of you are familiar with Dr. Isaacs' works on nationalism, on informality, and has this supreme skill of linking theory and empirics. And also he is currently an editor of Central Asian Survey, and we thought he would be the best fitted person to talk about the topic of today. today's discussion. So we will have now 40 minutes of lecture by Dr. Isaacs, followed by Q&A. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat or raise your hands and we'll get back to you in a Q&A session, which will be followed after the lecture. We'll have around 30 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, did you want me to start, Sofya?
Yes, please.
Okay.
The floor is yours, and
well,
you're welcome to share.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to this event. And the first thing I'd say is that this network is a great initiative. I think it's very, very useful to have this type of network where you can discuss, to some extent, both process and experience of writing, academic writing, and some of the sort of difficulties and obstacles that we all face to some extent. And often, of course, academia is a very, very lonely endeavor. So to have the opportunity to actually share those experiences with each other, I think is very valuable. So I'd commend both Gulzat and Sofya for this initiative. And it's nice, I actually see many, many familiar faces and names, so it's good to see people I haven't seen for some time. I would say I think Sofya was being a little bit exaggerating in terms of my supreme skill in connecting empiricism with theory, but I'll take it, as a compliment. But right, I'm going to share some slides now, if you bear with me a second. It's this one. Yeah, okay, so I'll try to talk for about 40 minutes. I do have a habit of going on a bit though, but we'll see how that goes. So the first thing is when Sofya and Gulzat approached me to give this talk, I was a bit uncertain about how to address it or how to approach the topic. It's very easy to get the impression that theory and data are discrete and distinct concepts. And often the question of how we can derive a research question from a theoretical problem and then operationalize it is dealt with very, very minimally, I think, in both sort of theoretical literature and also in the sort of literature around methodology. Let alone the question, I think, of how we get data from political and sociological theory and other sort of theories within the social sciences. I mean, I think there's a lot that's written on theory and there's a lot that's written on data and data analysis, but I think actually there is not so much that explores the relationship between the two. And if it does, it's in a very abstract and general sense. And to some extent, despite me saying that, I think I'm probably going to spend a lot of time talking in a general and abstract sense. But nonetheless, I think it is a useful discussion to start having, which is, what is this relationship between theory and data, or I'm going to use the term empiricism, but theory and empiricism. How do they relate to one another, and how practically actually can we, and how practically do they relate to each other in terms of the process of research that we are all involved in? So the second issue I had, I think, when thinking about, well, how do I approach this is like at the time, I mean, I was asked to provide a title and I thought, I don't know. What kind of title should I give this talk? I turned to my side, and on my bedside cabinet there was this book by an American poet and farmer and essayist and novelist called Wendell Berry, entitled Another Turn of the Crank. That image of a crank then seemed to somehow match or relate to this, my sense or my perception of this relationship between theory and data. So if no one knows what a crank is, it's a rod essentially which forms part of an axle or a shaft, which is used to turn interlocking mechanisms, so such as the example on the slide, and it turns them in a circular motion, right? And it can go back and forth, and obviously people have agency. We have agency to turn that crank. Now, I found the idea of a crank as a useful way to conceptualize this relationship between theory and data. I think for two fundamental reasons, right? The first is that basically theory and data, or theory and empiricism, however you wish to describe it, they are mutually constitutive. Excuse me, my dog is barking. Okay, shut up now. They are mutually constitutive. So theory and data basically make one another. And they're also interlocking. So when we think about the crank going round, you can often observe it as kind of often two cogs that the crank is turning and relating to one another. Basically, the thing is that theory and data are similar to kind of two mechanisms with which you would use a crank to move. So they're, in empirical research, theory and data are closely linked. Data is the main source for building and testing theories, and without theoretical focus, it's impossible to select and interpret data. And basically, as the researchers, we are responsible for turning that crank between theory and data. So that's the first fundamental reason why I think this idea of the crank is a useful way to conceptualize the relationship between theory and empiricism. The second is that obviously with a crank, when you're turning it between two interlocking mechanisms, it's going back and forth in a circular motion. And that's essentially what we should be doing, I think, with our relationship between theory and data. So it is important, and I think often this is where researchers, particularly either early career researchers, can often get lost, is seeing the process as linear. The relationship between theory and data is not linear. Okay, it's often it's not like I mean, you can start with theory and end with empiricism, but actually, in truth, the way the research process works in actuality is that you travel between the two in a constant process of motion, which is often why it's very, the whole, certainly when you're undertaking PhD research, it's why the whole process is very unsettling, moving between the two. It's filled with sort of uncertainty about the relationship between the two. So I think what I want to say overall, I think if I have an argument, which I don't, but if I did have an argument, it would be that it's important to see that the relationship between theory and data, or theory and empiricism, as a process, and a cyclical process at that. And you can also, I would say, you can describe it obviously as a dialectical process too, because between, working between theory and data, you should end up with a synthesis. You should end up with a new way of seeing or understanding a puzzle or a case or a problem or a question that may have been asked before, that may have been written on many times before, but the way in which, as individual researchers, we would seek to approach any particular problem, puzzle, question, is to, develop a synthesis between theory and data through a dialectical process. So throughout my discussion, I'm going to use the terms data and empiricism sort of interchangeably. I think I prefer the term empiricism as a way of sort of constructing this binary with data. This binary with theory. Data often feels a bit too natural sciencey for me, in terms of sort of measurement and statistics. That's not to discount the research that takes place within social science that uses a positivist approach. But for me, I find empiricism is sort of a bit broader and hopefully can account for more sort of interpretivist forms of scholarly analysis, as well as obviously quantitative positivist accounts too. So the other thing I just want to say before I continue is that even though Central Asian Studies is in the title, it's not really so much about Central Asian Studies. I mean, it really is. I'm trying to drill down to some extent about this relationship between theory and empiricism, and maybe also demonstrate some practicalities of the process within that. I will turn to Central Asia, obviously, as some forms of examples, but Central Asian Studies is in the title, but I think it's probably overstating the case. And the final thing I would say, actually, that this is really, as I said, there's no sort of specific argument here. It's more a sort of loose collection of thoughts on the relationship between theory and empiricism. I don't think anything I'm going to say here is definitive, and I don't think I'm coming at it from a sort of privileged position in any way. It's more sort of thoughts for discussion. Okay, so first of all, yeah, sorry, this was my second slide where I've just talked through, actually. Sorry, I put these slides up and then I forget to actually use them. So I've already sort of mentioned all these. Sorry, right, okay, so our starting point really has to be the question of what is theory? What if we want to set out to think about the relationship between theory and empiricism, then we need to actually have a sense of, well, what really is theory? And of course, it is understood in multiple ways. The most simplistic form, and which of course is not particularly analytical, is to understand theory as a sort of everyday approach, that it is something, that as a term that we can use colloquially to think about, having a hunch or an idea or a guess about something, but that's probably not adequate, of course, for our purposes. More specifically, in a sort of research and academic context, of course, theory is a framework for a logical framework, in fact, for describing the behavior of a related set of natural or social phenomena, supported by evidence that can often, but not always, be testable and predictive. That's obviously a more sort of positivist account of what theory can do. Theory can also be, or represent at the least, a model of reality. Okay, so, theory is marshaled from evidence and is used to portray some sort of description or understanding of real life social events and social behavior. Theory can also be a way to just simply simplify, it's tautological, to simplify the world around us, to organize our knowledge about the world around us. It helps us identify social relationships between different phenomena, and often, depending on which type of analytical school you come from, it has different purposes. For example, rational choice accounts are really seeking to provide very elegant theories as a way to sort of simplify complex phenomena. So when we look in some of the big American journals, for example, and they're filled with sort of very neat and eloquent equations, these are, attempts to use very sort of abstract theories as a way to sort of provide simple and elegant explanations of relations between particular social variables. Theory, of course, can also be about challenging common sense assumptions of our views in the way the world works. And and that's particularly, often I think you can see this in interpretivist and qualitative based research articles, where scholars will sort of seek to take existing bodies of literature. I'll come to the point that actually existing sort of literature can also be a form of theory in a moment. You take existing bodies of literature that have produced certain kind of common sense explanations of particular phenomena, and you can use theory as a way to challenge that by adopting a sort of new theoretical perspective or a new theoretical frame to challenge those types of assumptions in the existing literature. And of course, then the final way, or one final way at least, of thinking about theory is, of course, to see it as a normative approach. Now, normativity is often, is not very fashionable these days. You know, it can be used, or theory can be a way to describe the world as it ought to be. You know, for example, you know, obviously we can, you know, it can be about democracy. You know, if we're interested, you know, we are interested in the extent to which a theory can, you know, represent sort of the democratic ideal, and the extent to which cases are closer or further away from that ideal. You know, so if we are talking about democracy, we're usually sort of highlighting the attributes associated with democracy, such as, you know, free and fair elections, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of protest, etc. And we will evaluate, you know, the extent to which cases meet those particular attributes. I was thinking last night about this in terms of an example, and there's actually both in the Routledge handbook that I did with Erica, and then also that volume I did a couple of years ago with Alessandro Figaro on theorizing Central Asia, Galim Jusbek, he writes on, he actually, one of the reasons I like Galim's work is that he actually writes from a very normative perspective, which is not that common. He has a particular account of Islam in Central Asia, which is to observe it or understand it as being liberal, or being cognizant to kind of liberal politics or liberal society in some way. And that's a good, I think Galim's work is a very sort of good example of the use of normative theory, and he, you know, demonstrates both a kind of depth of knowledge around theological theory as well as in sort of theory around liberalism, in particular the work of John Rawls. So that's an example of sort of normative theory in practice in my experience of Central Asian studies. Yeah, Andreas Malm wrote that all action remains best served by conceptual maps that are mark out the colliding forces between some actually, not by blurry charts and foggy thinking, of which there is, as we shall see, no shortage. So what he's sort of suggesting here is that basically, you know, another way to see theory, or an important way, and it's perhaps one in which I would elide with, is to see theory broadly as a sort of some conceptual mapping that allows us to sort of mark out and see and observe and analyze and make connections between different sets of, for me, sort of social and political phenomena, rather than what Malm is critiquing there, of course, is perhaps the more sort of positivist approaches. Now, the point of talking through these different ways of defining theory is that, of course, the point is there are many ways to define theory, and how you define theory, or what you understand by theory, will determine the relationship it has with the sort of data and empiricism of your research. So is your, you know, are you collecting data to to test and measure theory? So do you set out with a theoretical, you know, hypothesis, a theoretical model, and then you know, collect data as a way to test and measure that? Or are you taking, you know, sort of a normative approach, you know, for example, around the question of how human rights should be in Central Asia? Or are you offering something more interpretive, such as, you know, conceptual mapping? As I said, but that would probably be my position, I think. And it's a more interpretive position. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of critiquing common sense assumptions. And it's a way of interpreting the world, hopefully, in a sort of a creative and an imaginative new light. Okay, so the next question, I think, then you know, that's different ways of defining theory or thinking about theory. Then the question is, well, what types of theories are there? And of course, there are. I mean, I've drawn them down into three categories here: grand theory, mid-range theory, and background literature. I'll just go over each one quickly. So, and again, it comes to this point, right? So it depends on not just how you define theory. Sorry, the relationship between empirics and theory depends on not just how you define theory, but also the type of theory that you are using. So grand theory, obviously, these are the theories that operate at a much higher level of abstraction. And that's any theory which attempts to provide an overall explanation for social life, of history, of human experience. Obviously, the most popular ones, I would say in the last 40 years, are around sort of critical theory, post-structuralism. We're talking about Foucault, we're talking about Gramsci to some extent. Now, the thing about grand theories is, of course, they offer very, very little, I would suppose, sort of guidance or signposts for researchers as how you might use them to guide or influence the collection of empirical evidence. I think it can be very difficult to take grand theories on this scale and then try to sort of particularly test a theory or draw an inference from empirical evidence, because you're dealing with theories and concepts at a great sort of level of abstractedness here. And so it can be very, very difficult to make linkages to I suppose, what we would call the real world. So that's challenging. Some of that theory basically works better as discussions around, I guess, meta-theoretical discussions. So discussions about theory, contributing theory to discussions about theory. So it's the meta-theoretical. Or to some extent, you can, of course, operationalize some of the concepts you find in these grand theories. But of course, then you're deconstructing some of those grand theories. By the way, I'm also aware of the slight paradoxical nature of, referring to post-structuralism and Foucault as a grand theory, where to some extent, of course, those were theories which sought to deconstruct the notion of grand theory. But nonetheless, they are within that realm in terms of the sort of high level of sort of conceptual abstraction. Anyway, but you can sort of deconstruct them, I think, and use them as conceptual maps. But still, I think it is challenging and difficult, and there's not really clear guidelines for that, I think. The second kind of type of theory we might engage with as scholars and researchers is mid-range theory, middle-range theory. So this is the sort of theory where it typically gives you much more guidance in terms of how to apply and operationalize in relation to research. So middle range theories tend to operate in a much more limited domain. So for example, a lot of my examples will come from political studies. So, democratizations or theories of electoral systems or theories of party system outcomes. These would be good examples of mid-range theory, where essentially they fall somewhere between grand theory and more sort of concrete, granular empirical findings. But the useful thing about mid-range theories, of course, I think they're much more straightforward and easy to operationalize, because they're operating at a less abstract level. Okay, and then the final way we can also sort of, I would say that the other type of theory that we can point to, and is probably very, very relevant for Central Asian studies, is background literature. So background literature, often background literature related to the topic often fuels the focus of an article or a book, and thereby acts as an equivalent of theory. As I think I already pointed to or mentioned earlier, literature can act as a spur to empirical inquiry, and perhaps this is, as I said, the most, I would suspect this is the most, actually from my experience of, editing Central Asian Survey, this is perhaps the most common way in which theory is used in relation to area studies, especially within Central Asia. And there's a number of things that background literature can do in relation to theory, or using it as a form of theory. And the first is that it can often resolve inconsistencies between different findings or between different interpretations of findings. So when you have a debate or a discussion within the literature where you will find sort of opposing interpretations or imposing findings about the same topic, this is where you can use that literature as a theoretical frame to sort of engage your empirical data. Of course, the most common way in which background literature is often used, and I think, from the time that people are undergraduate students, this is how they're often taught to think about theory, which is to spot a neglected aspect in the literature, the gap, the so-called gap. And again, this is something that's commonly used in articles. It's like, okay, there's been this on the topic, there's been this on the topic, but there hasn't been this, and this is the gap. One of the problems with that is always the case, I find, is that the first thing I'd say is, I'm sure, right, if you've ever studied or taught dissertation writing at universities, is that sometimes there's a very good reason there's not a gap, right? Which is that maybe it's not important, maybe it's not it's not particularly interesting, it's not particularly important. So with using the sort of justification of a gap in the background literature as a way, as a way to sort of comport theory, it has to be justified. There has to be a clear sort of intellectual justification for that. And that can be tough, actually. I mean, and it has to be convincing, and it's not always easy to do. Of course, background literature is often used, you can, particularly in sort of positivist studies, you can seek to retest previously tested ideas or findings. You might seek to develop an alternative approach to existing approaches on a topic. Now, I think theorists, sort of more purist theorists, may argue that research which has no obvious connection to mid or grand range theories is nothing but empiricism. But I think that's unfair. I think that's very, very an unfair sort of criticism, because such research which arises out of any sort of interrogation with existing literature is geared towards the illumination or resolution of problems, abstract problems or general problems from the outset. Literature essentially acts as a proxy for theory, and you can find theory implicitly and latently in a lot of that background literature. It does take a lot of digging and reading and interpreting to draw that out, but it is there. I think an example of this I want to just highlight is, and I mentioned this to Sofya and Gulzat before we started, which is an article that Scott Radnitz and Lawrence Makowitz wrote, just published actually in, in the journal that I did, Central Asian Survey. They just published this in this special issue that we put out in December. And what they do is they take comparative politics as a disciplinary field and review the extent to which Central Asian studies has contributed to comparative politics. So they're taking that background literature to examine the broader contribution, theoretical contribution, I suppose, of Central Asian studies to comparative politics. And they do that by they explain that there's been a shift from the macro to the micro in the study of Central Asia. So there's a focus on explaining rather specific granular outcomes, such as party system development or policing in the work of Erika Marat, or corruption in terms of the work of Johan Engvall, rather than doing sort of broad cross-comparison, large data sets type of research that focus on the state, which can tend to be the domain of comparative politics. We instead get sort of more granular, in-depth country ethnographies, okay, which can then often develop, distinct theoretical contributions from that existing scholarly literature, which is in the area study. Okay, I'll move on, considering time. Right. So the other thing we have to think about when thinking about this relationship between theory and empiricism is, well, you know, different disciplines. So depending on the discipline that you come from, are going to develop distinct approaches to the relationship between theory and empiricism. So I come from, I suppose, well, I don't like, I mean, again, here you go, here's my normative bias. I don't particularly like using the term political science. I prefer political studies, but I come from a political science background, and we tend, within political sciences, there is a tendency to sort of develop conceptual and theoretical frameworks first and then try to apply to specific cases. And that's often how the relationship works between theory and empiricism. In anthropology, of course, it's to some extent the other way around. There is a tendency to work from the ground up. We will often see sort of anthropological research where they begin from the point of ethnography and they work towards theory. So they tend to abstract upwards from the ground up, trying to work towards explaining the theoretical implications of a specific ethnographic case. Yeah, so if you read any ethnographic work, any sort of anthropological article, good ones, they tend to sort of begin with the sort of very granular ethnographic point based around often subjective experience, and then they move later in the piece towards greater abstraction. In sociology, the sort of relationship's a bit different. There's a tendency to work from the macro level downwards, a tendency to start with larger theoretical and conceptual categories such as power, such as class, capitalism, gender, etc., and then work towards the micro and granular. And then in history, often history tends towards description and also method and particular forms of data. So obviously, historians get very excited when a new archive might open or a new collection of papers is available in archives. So there's a tendency for to be more descriptive, to be more methods and data based. But actually, at the same time, of course, historians often work with sort of broader theoretical traditions, so grand traditions, or sort of a Marxist, Hegelian, or even sort of postmodern traditions. So I think, again, the point here is to think about, depending on your discipline, as a researcher, you are likely to have a different approach or understanding and method towards theory and its relationship with empiricism. And so that does have to be taken into account. What I want to just turn to now is, to some extent, drawing on my experience as I suppose as a a scholar or a researcher, both, I guess, as an editor, actually, to some extent, both of the journal, but also edited volumes, and thinking about some of the, particularly with Central Asian Survey, some of the papers that come in, and sort of thinking about what are some of the sort of observations of how theory, I put how theory is used here, but actually I'm thinking about the relationship between sort of theory and empiricism. What are the different ways in which I could categorize what I see that comes in? So I think there's a number, I don't want to call these mistakes. I don't think that's fair, but I think the ways in which people approach it, I suppose, which could be seen as less optimal to thinking about this connection between theory and empiricism. So the first is sometimes you'll see papers that come in which have no theory at all. Okay, so they're highly descriptive. They also may have very, very limited analysis. And you can see that there's no effort whatsoever to connect theory with description and data. Sorry, theory with data. What I would say, of course, is one of the issues in particular for thinking about publishing in articles in area study specific journals is, of course, area study specific journals on the one hand are asking you, well, are focused on, of course, making contributions to ongoing debates within the area. So one of the key things, obviously, for Central Asian Survey as a journal is that we're interested in seeing articles that contribute to existing debates in the field of Central Asian studies. So one of the issues you can get, you might get papers that have no theory at all. That still doesn't mean necessarily that it's unsuitable for Central Asian Survey, but at the same time, you might get a paper which is heavily sort of theorized, but actually says very, very little or makes very, very little contribution to Central Asian studies. And that's not suitable for Central Asian Survey. So I think that's the other sort of thing to consider, but this also relates to broader questions about, as a researcher, where you might see yourself in career terms as someone that is seeking to make a contribution specifically to Central Asian studies, or someone seeking to also at the same time contribute towards the broader sort of disciplinary debates and discussions as well. Anyway, that was a slight tangent. Nonetheless, so yeah, no theory at all is one way in which that I've sort of observed. The second is that I sometimes see papers that have some discussion of theory, but it can be sort of broad range theory that is often at the very sort of general and abstract level. And it can often be almost like a review, like, I mean, this is just thinking off the top of my head, and this is not something that, well, actually, sometimes you do see it with papers submitted, but it's something that's very, very common with undergraduate international relations dissertations, where students just go, oh, I need to write about theory, so I'm just going to write about, in my theory chapter, I'm just going to write about realism, liberalism, and maybe constructivism if I understand it. And that's kind of what I mean. It tends to be this type of discussion of theory, but that in many ways, any sort of informed reader, even of an area studies journal like Central Asian Survey, will have that knowledge and understanding of that theory at the very basic level. So you need to try, I mean, so there needs to be, to try to avoid these type of theory reviews of different sort of perspectives on a topic. In those papers, you then do see some empirical analysis of a particular case as well, but there's no connection between the theory and the empiricism. Then you might get sort of work which has a good discussion of theory, a good understanding, it's sophisticated, so overall a good level of theoretical analysis, it's complex, it's interesting. As a reader, you might actually learn something about that theory rather than the well established tropes. But then there's no empirical connection, limited sort of connection to the case. So they tend to operate, again, like I said at the beginning, as an understanding of two very sort of distinct concepts or discrete concepts between theory and data. Finally, you get those that have a good understanding of theory, a good discussion of theory, but also you then get the deconstruction and the critical engagement. So they deconstruct the theory. You would find the core components of that theory as concepts which can then be operationalized and then applied. Okay, and then applied to the case at hand, the particular case that the particular case which is the focus of the research. But then the issue often is that there's no synthesis, so there's no return, and to some extent, to the theory perhaps at the end. And that's the key, and that's really the point where I think if you're thinking about the relationship between theory and data, you want to get to that point of synthesis. You want to be able to give a sort of complex, sort of intellectually rigorous and sophisticated and deconstructed account of theory that is critical and applies it to a case, but then also returns back to that theory in terms of saying, giving us an understanding of what the case actually tells us about this theory in terms of our understanding of it. Okay. What's that? Right, so what I wanted to, I've just got basically 2 slides to finish, to talk through, and then I will finish. So I'll try and be quick with this. So I wanted to give some idea about, okay, so how do you get to that point of synthesis? What are the kind of things that you can actually do in practice? How can you turn the crank in practice? So I've got, I mean, these are just some, I suppose, practical guidelines, tips. These are some of the things that I do or try to do. I mean, it's not always possible to do them. And again, it also depends on the research that you're undertaking. So there's so many contingencies, actually. So this shouldn't be read as some kind of definitive or privileged list at all. So the first thing I think is really, really important is what I call a deep dive, as deep as possible. In a world in which we live in constant distraction, in particular of social media, where people can get lost down the rabbit hole of the internet, what I would suggest is to find the rabbit hole of theory. And what I mean by this is to really deep dive into the theoretical literature that you are considering in framing your research question and topic around. Really get into the general and conceptual stuff and try to read and synthesize as much as possible of what you can. So, for example, with my PhD, that was the first book. It was two bodies of literature, which I'll come to in a minute. One, it was patrimonialism and neo-patrimonialism, and then it was a lot of literature around party systems. So these were mid-range theories that I was dealing with. But I mean, obviously time is of the essence with a lot of this, but the thing is I try to read as much as possible about all kind of areas where these types of sort of concepts and theories were applied. And this would include cases in Africa and Latin America. And even if I never cited them, I never used them, I would still read them and think about them, and they inform somehow. Because I think the deeper you go, the more understanding, the more sophisticated understanding you have, and areas in where you can see those types of common sense assumptions that you can challenge, and areas and basically, you know, have a better grounding in the theory of where you'd be able to contribute with your case, with your empiricism. The second thing worth considering is basically when you have a theoretical approach is to tease out the key components or elements of that theory and concept. In other words, to deconstruct, to find actually what are the components that make this theory something that can work as a framework. I'm going to give an example of this in the next slide in a second. The point then is once you've broken down and deconstructed the theory into sort of component concepts, you then need to think about, well, actually, how do I operationalize those concepts of that deconstructed theory? What are the types of data that would go some way to explaining those concepts in a particular case? You know, what are the components, the specific components of that theory? Sorry, what is the data that I need to basically make that theory operational in a research context? And again, in the example I'll give in a second, I'll try to unpack that a little bit. Yeah, so going back to the point I was trying to make, well, at the very, very beginning, the thing about this is that it's not a linear process, right? Though it is possible to construct a fully formed theoretical framework and then go out in the field and apply it, I'm pretty sure like 95% of the time that, you know, it's a messy back and forth process, okay? And this relates to the mutually constitutive sort of nature of the relationship between theory and data. So it's, I mean, again, I can give an example of my PhD research where it was, I went out into the field actually with one particular approach and I came back with another. And that was through a consequence of data collection and what the data was telling me, and that I had to sort of reconfigure and think about how to sort of deconstruct this new way of thinking about it and then operationalize it. So it's not a straightforward process. we then have the sort of the issue of actually, okay, what do you, how, once you've collected data, you know, on the basis of this, you know, operational framework, you know, how do you do it? How do you take that data from what is essentially empirical granular evidence and make it abstract and connect it back to the data? And this is where I think you basically, this is the process of analyzing data. And of course, there's many different ways of doing this. And again, it all goes back to it depending on what you understand by data, what is the relationship between, what is your sort of disciplinary approach, what the question you're asking, what the case is. But in my particular sort of ontological and epistemological approach, for me, coding, and well, these ideas of theoretical sensitivity and coding and memoing, which I'll just talk about briefly now, they're really the keys, I think, for me in terms of abstracting data back to the theory. So there's different ways in which you can code data. Of course, there are there's also many computer programs as well. I've never really used them, to be honest, and I know they are quite popular, for example, but I tended to use sort of the approach of sort of theoretical sensitivity and memoing. So, but with coding, basically what you're doing is you're working directly with that data, you're fracturing it. So it's about breaking it up and analyzing it and trying to find what are the sort of the core categories within it. You're trying to, you know, what are the core categories that can link back to the theoretical approaches. And it's about, and this is just really a question of being very, very sensitive to the data, just studying it really closely, giving it meaning, having the sort of, and what we mean by sensitivity, basically what I mean by sensitivity is the ability to basically understand what is pertinent in the data and what isn't. You know, what are the things that come through consistently, for example, in interviews? How can you distill those ideas or the things that people say, basically, how can that are commonly occurring in interviews, how can you distill that into a category that makes sense in terms of the data that you are, the theory that you are proposing? So, and then, and one way is, I think, practically for me to always do that was with memoing. So I don't know how people work, but constantly writing about, you know, particularly if you're using interviews, for example, if you're undertaking semi-structured interviews, immediately coming out of those interviews, some people will seek to write up the interview transcript straight away, and that's generally a good way of doing it. But the other is just to sort of sit down and reflect on what was said in the interview, what you thought came through importantly, and make connections between the things that are people saying, the ways in which you can understand them as specific coded categories in the data. How do they connect up? And I will spend a lot of time drawing diagrams in notebooks between different elements that emerge from the data, and thinking all the time with that kind of head of sort of theoretical sensitivity on how does this link back to the ideas that, you know, or the sort of core components of the theory that I'm interested in here. How does it link back? How do they connect? Sometimes they're not going to connect. Sometimes you might tear your hair out thinking this doesn't work, it doesn't make sense. But other times things do come into place and things shift. But I think that constant process of writing stuff, I know it sounds really simple, and it is in that sense. I mean, like, if you're thinking about how to connect data to theory, writing stuff down, trying to make connections all the time, and being very sensitive to that in your research, I think is the key to doing it. Okay, so just a quick example of operationalization here in terms of, so this was from I suppose the PhD in the book that came out a long time ago now. I can also talk to some extent about more recent projects, but this diagram, so I think, you know, this diagram actually emerged from one of these memos, okay, that I was writing. So as I mentioned in that book, it's on party system formation in Kazakhstan and its relationship essentially to kind of informal politics. And I had the concept of neo-patrimonialism that I want to work from. And I've got two bodies of literature there. On the top, you've got neo-patrimonialism. Okay, and I break that down into the components essentially of informality versus formality, and what the different aspects of that you know, could define or through which, sorry, we could see the dynamics of a neo-patrimonial regime. So you see there's three kind of informal patrimonial concepts, and then two formal concepts in relation to rational bureaucratic structures and the constitutional liberal aspect. And then I've got this literature on party systems, which is, you know, from the literature, from that deep dive into the literature, you observe kind of three categories. And then you've got these micro attributes. Now, what I would say is with this, again, just to demonstrate this process of mutual constitution, I didn't have this when I went out into the field, right? So this framework develops as a consequence of that coding, of that memoing, and of that sort of theoretical sensitivity. So in particular, it was particularly with the attributes, the micro attributes in relation to political parties, party organization, ideology, behavioral norms, etc., it really was the case of going back and forth. It's a combination of there's a large literature obviously on institutional choice and electoral design, but stuff around behavioral norms or disconnection and passiveness in the societal links category, these were, you know, these emerged from the data. So obviously, you know, but the three broader categories, formal institutional constraints, party typology, and societal links, they were formed prior to going out to fieldwork. So it really is a combination of the two, and of going back and forth, of really turning that crank each time. And yeah, and so once, I mean, I you know, obviously it was clear that to make, you know, I knew that, you know, interview data was going to hopefully tell me a lot about the internal workings of parties and their relationship to informal, sort of the neo-patri informal regime. But that was obviously combined with documentary analysis, media sources, reports, and so on. Yeah, okay, so that I'm going to stop now. So what do I, if I have a conclusion, do I don't actually. So I think these are just a series of kind of thoughts and reflections on this relationship between theory and empiricism. I have talked a lot longer than I'd intended, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I'm going to be quiet until you ask me questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question, Rico. Sometimes during our lectures, we do share articles because not everyone has institutional access to them. Would you be happy if I share the article that you mentioned by Markowitz and Radnitz?
Yeah. Okay,
I'll do that in chat. So for those of you who wants to read it, download and learn, it's going to be here. Do we have any questions? First questions from the audience? Naomi, Anna? Zarina, anybody else? Okay, we have one raised hand. Aida, yes, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Rico.
Hi.
Thank you very much for this presentation. And it is really like engaging and giving many material to think about and reflects on what we have done already and on what we can do for further. Especially, I like the way, I like the slide about your observations on how theory was used in the articles that you have read. And I wonder, could you give an example, let's say, kind of ideal example of an article that you have read or that have been published that is having good theory good discussion of theory, and then it is also deconstruct something from that theory, and then critically engage in that theory, and also suggested some synthesis. It is very ideal, and I wonder if it is, because usually it is 8 or 10,000 words, and you have to, especially in anthropology, also we like to give detailed ethnographic examples, and then sometimes you think, do you have to give more place for ethnography, or also how to get into this engagement? And if you could give, not only to name the title of the article, but also deconstruct it in these parts that you gave us.
Okay, wow. Thanks. That's a good question. What I'm going to do, I was just trying to, because there's obviously, off the top of my head, I'm trying to think what would be a good example. The first thing, so we're going to publish a reader. I'm publishing a reader later this year. We've selected excerpts from articles from Central Asian Survey over the last 40 years, because it's celebrating its 40th anniversary. And you're mentioning anthropology, and I think I wanted to say, yeah, so I was going to say actually probably, so I mean, it's just because it came to my mind and you mentioned anthropology, probably Madeleine Reeves's article. It's from 2011. I can give you it's which volume number 33, issue number 3 to 4. The article is Staying Put Towards a Relational Politics of Mobility at a Time of Migration. I might be able to share this again on the chat if people bear with me, if I can figure out how to do that. But actually, I might just focus on answering the question first. But anyway, so first thing I'd say, of course, it's not, I mean, it's important to understand that you don't have to achieve everything in a single article. I hope I didn't give the impression that somehow that every piece of work that you need to do has to achieve all of these things. I think that to some extent would be unrealistic as well, because it depends on a number of things. It depends on all the things I was talking about in terms of which discipline. It depends on where you're publishing it. It also depends on what your research question is. And if your research question is aimed at offering a more micro or granular level account of something, that is, of course, in of itself still valid and important, and can easily be a very, very good and excellent piece of work. So that's I mean, it's that said, right? So that's the first thing I want to say is it's important not to get too bogged down in thinking that we need to do absolutely everything. But and also if you're submitting, as I said in the talk, if you are submitting to Central Asian Survey, then of course the premise really, or another area studies journal, Central Asian Affairs or Europe-Asia Studies, if you look at the papers that are published there, more often than not, they're trying to contribute to sort of debates within the area and the field. That's the point of those journals. The question around, so I think the point about good discussion of theory, critical engagement of theory, and that balance between theory and in your case, thinking about anthropology and ethnography, that would be if you were wanting, I think, to submit papers or research that would go into broader disciplinary journals. So, because what the case becomes, or what the area study case becomes, is the case to think about broader, general, abstract theoretical questions. Having said that, I mean, of course, still you want to have some, with anything you write, you want to have an ideal of trying to sort of deconstruct theory and so on. So I wanted to, I mean, I could, just off the top of my head, in terms of thinking about Central Asian studies and anything in Central Asian Survey. So Madeleine Reeves' article from 2011, Staying Put Towards a Relational Politics of Mobility at a Time of Migration. So I think Madeleine's work has always been very, very excellent, particularly in anthropology, of managing that boundary between the theory and the empiricism. So, she's already in the title, for example, just to deconstruct it, you can see that she's talking about abstract concepts. She's talking about a relational politics is, of course, an abstract concept. Mobility is an abstract concept in terms of in terms of sort of anthropology. And then you've got migration, of course, which is more empirical, but actually in the title, if you think about the title, and it's actually in the journal Central Asian Survey, the title doesn't specify at all anything to do with Central Asia. So already at that point, you can see that her paper is operating at a slightly sort of more abstract level. But then, I can, just examining the abstract, you can see that she approaches it through the literature on labor migration in Central Asia. And then she focuses on a particular gap in the literature, which is, so she talks about labor migration, which she basically argues much of the literature is focused on outward migration, but actually less attention has been paid to those that stay at home. So family members that stay behind. Then she has the ethnographic, obviously it draws on considerable ethnographic research. But she basically then, using that ethnographic account, so she's, I think she spent time with with the wives of migrant husbands in Eastern Uzbekistan. She then goes back to using those ethnographic accounts to give us a much richer understanding of labor migration, okay, and in particular on this idea of scales of movement. So I think I would give that, so I'd say, yeah, Madeleine Ries's piece is a good example of that, particularly in anthropology.
Rico, I think we have another question from Zarina.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Rico, for this interesting and full of knowledge presentation. I have a question, two questions actually.
Yeah.
So my first question is about the types of theories you mentioned. You said that background literature type is more common for Central Asian studies. What do you think, why it is that, why it is so? Is it about capability of those who study Central Asia, why they, or we cannot go to the abstract level, meta level of debate and discussion? And the second is more about like my personal skills, I would say. So English is my fourth or even fifth language, and I'm from Kyrgyzstan, and I can write in Kyrgyz and Russian, maybe beautifully articulating in an abstract level, but when it comes to the English, maybe I am doubting myself first, and second, also understanding and interpretation of theories written in English. I cannot compete with Madeleine Ries.
Of course.
So what can I do as a anthropologist from Kyrgyzstan trying to do her research and PhD in Western Academy? Thank you very much.
Thanks for your questions. So your question about, I was saying sort of Central Asian studies sort of predominantly uses this background literature. I don't think it's got anything to do with capability or skills of anyone. I think it's a natural consequence of the fact that it's area studies. And the question is, what are we aiming to do with area studies? What's the purpose of it? I mean, it's to try to have a deeper understanding of the particular and in the case of Central Asian countries, particular social and political phenomena within Central Asian countries. That's the purpose of it. So it's natural that to some extent there's going to, much of the sort of theory emerges from background literature. Not all of it. The key, I think, is then actually trying to and I don't think, and by the way, I would say this it's actually got nothing to, I don't think it's got anything to do with Central Asian scholars specifically. I think this cuts across the board in terms of most scholars working on Central Asia, actually. And not, I mean, I think you can, and the same applies also to any form of area studies, even the study of British politics, to be honest with you. So, but the key, of course, is how you use the particular and the general, all those contributions, sorry, in terms of the case, in relation to the background literature, to try to abstract that and say something more broadly about sort of social and political theory. The first thing I'd say, it's not easy to do. I mean, look, we're all not going to be Pierre Bourdieu, okay? As much as we'd all like to be, we're not going to be Foucault, as much as we might want to be. I think the important thing to bear in mind is, you know, what do we want to achieve, really? I think we just would, I mean, so, okay, this is my perspective anyway. What's the purpose of what we do? Why do we do it? It comes to that question. And I think it is about, it's really about trying to make some small contribution to debates and discussion and understanding and to scholarly knowledge. It's, you know, it's very difficult to operate at, you know, in terms of making those large conceptual and abstract contributions to theory and scholarship. It's very difficult to do. One of the things is you often need to come from a particular background to do that. So we can talk about disadvantages in terms of regionality, but there's also class disadvantages as well in terms of even within Western scholarship. Okay, there's considerable disadvantages for many scholars. So that's not to say you shouldn't aim for that, by the way, and to believe that you can do it. But I think the important thing is to recognize that you have a voice. It is important to make a contribution. And there are different ways in which you can make a contribution. And we don't all have to be Foucault or want to be Foucault. Oh, sorry, that was weird. So that's the first thing I'd say about that. Sorry, your second question was about your particular positionality, wasn't it? Yeah, that's, sorry, can you remind me of your second question, Zarina?
Yeah, I was saying that, I cannot compete or compare my capability of writing and publishing with those who are native English speakers, and also in understanding and the theories as well, and interpreting, using them to put them to my empirical data.
Yeah, I don't think, well, okay, so again, I think, yeah, that's not easy. And I mean, and of course, this is this, you know, with this move towards decolonization within Central Asian studies, I think that's, you know, that's an incredibly important movement that, as you know, as the editor of Central Asian Survey, I'm trying very hard to help as much as I can, help to see that develop through what I can do. I mean, that's one of the challenges. I mean, and that's what, it's a structural challenge, right? It's not something that, you know, we can, you know, it's a historical and structural challenge in terms of, and it's not, you know, it's also about inequity of resources. If you don't, I mean, like Sofya mentioned, if you don't have access to the right, you know, library depositories, then it's going to be hard to access that type of stuff to read. Look, I can only admire people that write scholarship in a language that's not their, you know, their first language. You know, I personally can't do it myself, so it's difficult for me to give advice and guidance other than to say I think it's amazing. I really do, that the particularly scholars, young scholars from the region, are working really hard and trying to engage in this, and they do it in a language that's not their first language. And of course, I mean, in general, I mean, look, there's also another issue to this, which is, again, is not related to regionality, which is often the language and discourse of scholarship is deliberately obscure. and I've always understood that as a very elitist thing, like it wants to keep certain people out, okay? But I think that to some extent, the more that you write and the more that you contribute, the more understandable it comes for others. So I think, you know, everyone in this network or who shares the sort of same concerns that you do has an important role actually in contributing to improving that. In terms of practical things that you can do, I mean, it's hard. I mean, just the thing is, keep reading as much as you can, asking questions, taking advice and guidance from people you think may have some understanding or knowledge, and it does get. And the fact is, the more, like I was saying with this deep dive thing, right? The more that you read, the deeper you go, the more understanding you have. And there's no, to some extent, there's no shortcut to it, right? So I think we often live in a, you know, I've got a big critique of contemporary society. We live in a world where we're looking for short-term solutions and easily distracted by things. And I don't think there's a shortcut to really having that in-depth, sort of sophisticated, rigorous understanding of theory and scholarship in general. Yeah, that's I don't know how helpful that is.
I think we have time for one more question. We've got 10 minutes left. Anyone? If not, can I just make a short comment to what Zarina just talked about? I don't know if you came across a recent piece by Alima Besenova. She wrote in Russian. It's called «Поле и жизнь. Размышления укоренелого антрополога», where Alima exactly writes about it. She compares Chukan Valikhanov and Alexei Levshin. And Alexei Levshin is this classic Russian ethnographer who writes a big theory in the 18th century about Central Asian peoples. And Chukan Valikhanov just writes a small ethnographic notes. And Alima Besenova makes an argument that in a long run, all these big theories, they die. And it's like, if Rico used this metaphor of crank, I would say theory and data is like bone and flesh. Yeah. And if you don't have a bone, you know, it's really difficult to compare what's more important. And Alima makes a case that Chukan Valikhanov's work with time is more popular than Levshin's work because it has this originality, it's insider's view, what have you, and it doesn't have a lot of theory. So it is interesting, her point.
What do I think? I certainly wouldn't agree that I don't quite understand the point that theory dies. I disagree. I think theory, theory stays a long time. It stays thousands of years. I mean, and for example, you know, when Trump was elected to the White House, everyone started quoting and reading Plato again. Or, you know, after Trump was elected, Hannah Arendt, I mean, it's not as old as Plato, but Hannah Arendt's, you know, The Origins of Totalitarianism was a bestseller in America. I think the idea that theory dies, I don't buy that. The important thing to know, I would say, is that it's not to say that theory is important is not to say that the point I'm getting at is not to say that empiricism or ethnographic work is not important. The point is they both are. And the point to say that they're mutually constitutive is to say that they compose one another. Okay, so you can't have each one doesn't make sense without the other. That's my argument. I think what I'm saying.
Vlad Bergim, yeah, you can go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Thank you all for organizing. It's also really nice to have the discussion now. I was curious, and I don't know, maybe it's a question more to you as a sort of editor, but I was wondering how many people actually engaged with grounded theory, because grounded theory approach is exactly about both of things together. Yeah. And, although, of course, it depends who you're reading, you know, if you're more on the Strauss side or whatever. And sometimes, you know, some people are super much into theory that they forget the importance of empiricism, but I felt like this is a really good way to sort of keep both of them together. And I was wondering like how Central Asianists were able to do that. And because I don't think I ever really read anything, but I'm not a specialist on Central Asian survey, but I don't think I really read a lot of like works that would use this approach. That would be the first question. And the second question, also going back to what Zarina said, like, I was wondering if the journals also trying to accommodate the fact that people speak different languages and like whatever. Maybe you could just briefly mention that. That would be interesting as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So the question of grounded theory is really important. I didn't mention grounded theory, but basically a lot of the things I was talking about relate precisely to that. Of course, the first thing about grounded theory is it's not a theory. It is an approach. And as you mentioned, I didn't want to go into grounded theory because it can get quite complex with the argument, the different sort of strands within it. And personally, I always adopted a constructivist approach to it that Helen Chamez uses. But you don't, you don't see, one of the problems, this might start to change, but I think one of the issues actually is methodology itself tends to be left out when you write journal articles. And what I mean by that is not that we don't talk about the methodology so much. I think Zarina mentioned, like, you've only got 8,000 to 10,000 words. You don't have a lot of space to kind of cover everything. It's very, very hard. And then methodology is one of the things that often gets kind of condensed down into a paragraph. And actually, it's the same if you are, I don't know where everyone is in their careers, but if you're sort of coming towards the end of your PhD and you're contemplating turning that into a book, that's one of the things that will get not lost, but will get condensed into something much, much shorter. Because in sort of the publication of PhD theses, publishers, don't want whole chapters on methodology, even though you might have written a sort of very beautiful and elegant 7,000-8,000 words in your thesis on methodology, which might be describing the sort of the nuances of taking a grounded theory approach to data collection and theoretical production. Publishers are not interested in that so much. That tends to be isolated into either journals and books which focus specifically on methodology. But what you do see, but then at the same time, what you can see in journal and in many of the articles now is we often get these, depending on the approach, we'll get these supplementary appendices which we allow authors to publish online, and this can run to many, many pages, which basically have a higher level kind of description and breakdown of data. This tends to work more specifically with positivist-based sort of quants approaches. But you can also see that in some qualitative forms of authorship. But grounded theory, I've always been, even though if I don't talk about it specifically, grounded theory is generally something I've always personally kind of used myself. And I use it mostly as a kind of set of tools. Like I find it a really helpful set of tools to actually think about that relationship between empiricism and data. And when I was talking about coding, that's essentially what and theoretical sensitivity and memoing, they're from this sort of grounded theory tool set. And I just didn't want to go into too much detail because there's different types of coding that we can get into, but that's another rabbit hole. Sorry, I've also now forgotten your second question. It was about speaking, the helping sort of authors that are writing.
Yeah, exactly.
Language. Yeah. So
we're accommodating this issue generally.
Yeah. So at Central Asian Survey, of course, we're very, very sensitive to that. Given we get a lot of submissions from scholars from the region. One of our key missions is to try to be that venue for, in particular, early career scholars from Central Asia to, get a publication, to hopefully get us, a publication with us to start off with. And we are sensitive to that. So to some extent, when I'm seeing an article for the first time, when it first comes across my desk, and I'm not at that point interested in how well it's written in English, right? Because there's ways around that. Okay, we do have proofreaders and editors, and of course people are encouraged also to try and get a native speaker to read over it. I will also edit pieces as well. I can, depending on the nature of how it's written, help sort of heavily edit for language as well at certain points. But my main goal is always to try to ensure that Central Asian Survey is a forum for young scholars, especially from the region, to publish in and to have the opportunity to publish. Obviously, that's dependent on it being a good piece of research and work, and that is always variable across the spectrum. I would note, I think that the Oxford Society has published this database with numbers of articles that have been published by Central Asian scholars. I went through it. It was some months ago, so I don't know if it's been updated, but I counted that of the 270 odd published articles, 101 of them have been published in Central Asian Survey. That was about just over 30 odd %. So, you know, I think, and that demonstrates actually our commitment as much as possible to that. Yeah.
Well, and on that note, we will say thank you to Rico for this enlightening conversation about empiricism and data. And to all of you, thank you for joining us today and for your active participation. It's always wonderful to see familiar faces and have this community of scholars that supports each other. Let's keep in touch and let's continue this discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.